have to say here is that what I'm going to say doesn't represent the views of the University of California. So starting again with the broad definition of science policy. So it's really a very broad term that refers to the allocation of resources for the conduct of science towards serving public interest. So it's very outward focused towards societal value of your work. And different areas that might be encompassed here are the funding of research, careers of scientists, as well as translating scientific discoveries into technological innovation. And some of the goals are promoting commercial product development, as well as competitiveness and economic growth and development. And this is only a subset of the value that your work has in terms of economic impact, as well as competitiveness, as in maintaining the US competitive on a global scale in different policy topics. So you might ask yourself then, why would you engage in policy? So the main thing here is that it gives you a really broad way of thinking about the issue that you're working on, expands your understanding of the world, and places your issue or problem in a larger context. And it allows you to address societal problems that really matter and gives you that, I think, sort of motivation to work on these because you know that you are able to make a broader impact. If you're interested in a specific area, which is really, it's a good way to go if you're sort of developing your skills in this area and build on that. It's very motivating to be working on something that you care about and be able to influence it from the policy standpoint. And one thing to note here is that you do have a lot of expertise that you're bringing to the table from your research and the skills that you developed in school. And that's very valuable when you're talking to policymakers who are not scientists, for most of them are not. And you're really bringing that expertise to them and you're a resource for them. Policy also allows you to become involved with the community. So now, especially with COVID, a lot of scientists are doing things, volunteering and doing outreach and being out there more for the public to see. And I think that's really important to think about scientific enterprise in general, is how do you reach out to the public and the community that is affected by your science. And the last one is, again, bigger picture impact on a larger scale. So I sort of see this as a scientist who spent many years working on a project and being sort of buried in that and publishing on that, and it was great. But at the same time, I was missing this kind of broad impact of where is this research going to go? Who is it going to help? How is it going to impact the world? And so I think that policy is a way to do that. It's not the only way to do that, but again, it gives you that kind of broader picture and impact. So in terms of basics, one thing to note is that science and policy are interconnected, and there are two basic concepts here. One is science for policy, the other one is policy for science. So science for policy refers to what you might typically think of policy, and that scientific findings are used as the basis to develop public policy. So public policy needs to be evidence-based. And on the other side, policy for science refers to laws and regulations and policies that affect the practice of science. And so this is more of how do we improve the research system? What does it mean to do that from the policy standpoint? And depending on the type of job you have, you may end up doing one or both of these. But just to keep in mind, there's a lot of interplay between the two and these concepts. So I thought I would just show you a few areas of policy. As I said, it's very broad. It can be really applied to anything that you can think of. There's a policy around that. That also is at different levels, right? So you have university policy, you have federal and state policy, and this particular slide is from congress.gov. So these are the things that Congress thinks about, bills that they come up with, and discuss. So these numbers here, a lot of them refers to bills that are being indexed and discussed in Congress. And so this is just to show you the breadth of issues that they talk about and vote on, to give you an idea of how broad science policy is. And there's a lot of things here that I think you can relate to and probably interested in. So I'd encourage you to go to congress.gov is a good resource to see what bills are being discussed and going through Congress right now on your topic of interest. So the other side of this, and I added this in here because I'm talking to you specifically from the engineering side, is how does engineering interplay in this aspect. So here, thinking about, again, the interplay between engineering, technology, and society, and how that affects society broadly. So coming backwards from how society affects technology, society for technology. So this is one term that society obviously is largely responsible for setting the goals and framing problems that engineers work on. And at the same time, the technology that you design will profoundly change the society in which you operate. So again, to keep in mind, the bigger picture of what you're doing is will have a societal value, and again, the interplay here between technology and society. So keep that in mind as we move forward. So again, specifically for engineering, I looked up a few areas, and this is one of the public policy schools. So there's a lot of these, obviously, across the country. This is just one example to show you a few areas that you might be interested in. And these are very, I would say, pretty hot topics right now in policy, and they give a good broad view of what's happening and what people work on. So to give you an idea of how this would work, if you work in climate and environment, for example, you would be doing research on greenhouse gases in order to affect policy change. And what does that look like? If you work in energy systems, a lot of this is how do you use energy? How do you produce it? How do you use it for the greater good? How do you address societal needs that are based on this area? Risk analysis is another area where this is pretty broad, but thinking about how does the public relate to risk, right? So again, it can refer to a lot of different areas, but thinking about behavioral decision theory, if there is an issue that has high risk associated with it, how are you going to convince the public that that's something they should care about or not? So part of the goal of policy is also to increase public participation, and this is one area that is, it's difficult to do, but it's interesting in this context. Technology innovation policy. So this is sort of inside the black box of what they're calling this, which is individuals who are in the field, know what the gaps are, and know how technology needs to change in order to affect the economy. So one of the results here might be economic prosperity. Again, that's a big area. And the last one is information and communication technology. So again, a lot of this is online privacy, cybersecurity, internet policy, all of these things that affect everybody, and again, are important for policy development. So I guess the sort of take home from this slide is that all these different actions and types of research that you might do on specific policies and areas will lead to some of these outcomes, either policy change, thinking about how it addresses societal needs, how it's going to impact the public, economy, and other things. So it's pretty broad, but gives you an idea of how, again, how broad engineering policy is and what different things you might do. So now, now you have some basics. I want to walk you through how do you actually make policy and what does that mean? So policy is being made at different levels. So you probably know about the three branches of government. So everything happens starting from the Constitution. The legislative branch is where laws are made. This is where Congress acts. They're then taken over to the executive branch, which carries out the laws, which is where the president is. And the judicial branch evaluates the laws, which is the Supreme Court and other courts, and everything sort of feeds into the executive branch where the laws are carried out. And so how does that work? How do you make the policy from start to finish? So one thing here to note is that any idea that you have can potentially become a bill. Just to motivate you that, again, this is a high level, and a lot of the things to think about in advocacy and policy are related to legislation. And because that's a very powerful way to impact an issue. And so the thing here is that any idea that you have can become a bill that is being passed potentially. Again, there's different outcomes, but the way it works is that if you contact your officials or local representatives, again, they like hearing from you as a constituent. They might be interested in writing a bill about that issue. The bill is introduced by a sponsor, which is usually a representative who's willing to sign on it and saying this is a good idea. Then it goes to the committee, which is essentially a small group of representatives and senators that meet, discuss it, vote on it, and then goes to the floor for further research. So we might go into a specific subcommittee. For example, one is the Health Science Committee or subcommittee that deals with science issues specifically. And after the Congress debates and votes on it, it'll go to the president where it can be approved or have different outcomes. So it can either pass and it becomes a law in that case, or it can be vetoed, go back to Congress and be edited, or it can be totally rejected. Again, there's a lot of outcomes here, and a lot of things depend on what's happening during the year. So a lot of things have been passed because of COVID to try and maintain research and funding that wouldn't have normally been allocated, has been allocated to research projects due to COVID. So that has gone through this process. So now that I told you, okay, how does this work? So how do I write a good policy, right? So one, again, like any research that you do, you need to be aware of the topic and the need for that policy. So what does the political landscape look like? Have there been other bills on that? And that's where congress.gov comes in. Have specific representatives supported that issue before and who that is, and that helps you know who to go to try and get them to support your idea. So a lot of this is knowing a lot about the topic and what's been done before, where the policy that you're interested in fits in. Being really clear about the concepts and key points that you're talking about, as well as the overall purpose and goal. And so this is something that you learn as you craft legislation. You learn how to write this after a while. Determining the scope. So this can mean, do you want this to be a state law? Is it a federal law? Who is going to impact? Is going to be a university, your local government, is going to be an international law, etc. So there's a lot of different levels here depending on the scope and the stakeholders that you want to impact with the policy. And as you develop it, you will have a certain standard. So there's a certain standard language to follow. And then you want to have a clear course of action that you're asking your stakeholders to do. So what do you want them to do? Are you asking for funding? Are you asking for programs? What is the ask in the policy? And how do you see that being carried out? So a lot of times this happens afterwards. If you're pitching a bill to somebody and they're going to ask you, how do you see this actually implemented by that particular stakeholder after it's being signed? So having a clear course of action and defining the procedures and the implementation is really helpful. This is just like any project that you have, thinking beyond how will it be implemented. And determining the short-term and long-term impacts. Again, depending on what the policy is, especially now with COVID, this is a good example to think about how will funding for research affect students who are in the system and other researchers on the short term, and what does that mean in the long term once COVID is over, or when there's another pandemic, what is the long-term impact of this funding, and can we continue doing research with funding that's being allocated now, or will that change after? So questions you might think about when you're crafting a policy, again, the broad questions, what is the existing landscape and what need will the policy fill, right? So this is true of any research project. You need to know the background and what's been done before, what's been supported, what your goal is with the policy, again, something new that hasn't been done, what possible outcomes you might have. So again, there's advantages and disadvantages. So you're gonna have probably representatives who are supportive and some that are not, and how would you address the counter arguments, right? And then on the practical side, how will this policy be monitored and enforced? Who will manage it? How much time and effort will it take? Again, practical things to think about when you're selling your idea. These are things that you need to think about. And the long-term impact on stakeholders, again, depending on the scope and the scale and who you want to impact. So you want to be very clear on who the audience is for the policy. And okay, that looks weird now because I switched the slides. Now I'm going to shift now more into skills. And now that you kind of know how to do this, where the question is, okay, policy, where can I do policy and what do I need to do that well? So these are some of the settings, and it sort of follows based on the different types of positions that you might have. So think tanks and universities a lot of times will be more on the research side. So basically what my role is, like an analyst type position, where you would be doing research on legislation. Other groups such as professional societies, nonprofits, and biotech companies, for example, do a lot of lobbying. So we also do that in the university, but not all the groups here are actually able to lobby for a specific area. So federal and state governments, this is just to give you an idea of obviously the scale of the policy can be federal or state. So depending on what you want to do, you would address specific representatives. And however, funding agencies like NIH, for example, doesn't lobby, right? So they're neutral, they can do statements, they can do research and release statements, but it's not a lobbying type of role. So that is a different way to do that. And Capitol Hill is where everything happens. Bills are signed. So if you work on the Hill, you might actually get the opportunity to go through the process that I described and actually advocate for what you're working on. And really all these other groups, have different Capitol Hill days, for example, and other events where they advocate for their cause throughout the year, specific times of year, et cetera. And we also do that for University of California. So it's a very common way to sort of feed the funnel into Capitol Hill where things are being done. So as I mentioned, the settings. So I want to just now tell you a little bit about what do these job titles look like and what does that mean? What the different things look like. So when you look for jobs, as I said, it's very broad, and it does fall into these different categories, which are pretty distinct, can be overlapping. If you work more on research and policy, you would be an analyst. So you could be analyzing health policy, for example, programs, as well as legislation, which again, that's what my role is. Taking this a little further to communicating and promoting science. Again, this is more in the advocacy realm of being an advocacy manager. Public affairs, public engagement, these sorts of things would fall under here. Government relations is sort of both because we do both legislation and we're on the Hill quite a lot, so it's kind of a mixed role. And then lobbyist would be sort of the extreme, I guess, or this is somebody that essentially spends their whole time building relationships with representatives and will be on the Hill probably most of their time. Then there's the programming side. So this is where a lot of jobs at NIH would be something like this, health program specialists, where they analyze and create programs for government, which can be related to STEM or education or the pipeline, et cetera. So that is another avenue. But it is different from being an analyst looking at legislation. So that's a different type of position. And public service, so this is more, again, outward facing, so government positions. Some of them will be this policy advisor. So if you're the policy advisor for the president, again, this is a very high level and scale where you're thinking about how is this going to affect the broader public and broader scale. And the last one is the Senate and the House. So this is, this is something that it's difficult to know, but there are ways to actually get jobs on the Hill, which I think everybody wants. If you work on congressional committees, they really have the power to vote on a lot of these things, as you saw in the diagram. I mentioned the Health Science Committee is one that works on a lot of the science issues and has influence there. And it's a very interesting role as well. So you can kind of see the breadth of issues here and the different things you can do and the different titles. So more on the professional development side now. If you're interested in policy, hopefully I piqued your interest a little bit today. Now, how do you actually learn about what's out there and get involved? So being aware of what's around you, this is, there's news everywhere. You can read newspapers, read it online. Social media is a great way to find out what's going on. Everybody that has events coming up will be there. Twitter in 24 hours, you can see what's going on, and a lot of policymakers are on there. You can follow them and see what they're discussing. So engaging in policy discussions can happen either obviously in person on the Hill, and now it's through Zoom, I guess, or social media, where a lot of things happen, and a lot of policy organizations are also there and release their events now. Especially now, there's a lot of virtual events that you can join for free to learn about policy. So I would encourage that as well. Writing is a large part of this, so I'll touch upon this a little bit, but writing op-eds and blog posts, and really anything that is non-scientific type of writing, is very helpful, because it helps you, again, write about and think about your research in a broader context and what a non-scientist will be interested in. And this is something that you would do whether you're talking to the public or policymakers that likely won't have the background that you have. And so you need to be able to explain your research in terms that they understand. If you want to delve a little deeper and learn more, informational interviews are really helpful. So I do a lot of these from students who want to go into policy and ask me questions about how did I transition, what do I do now? So I did a lot of this when I was starting out, when I was a postdoc, and I didn't know a whole lot about policy, and did a lot of this trying to build your network and meet people who are in policy, and then ask them who else you can talk to, and build your network that way. So this is really critical, because a lot of science policy works based on relationships, kind of who you know. And so it's important to continue this. You can call your representative. So this is something, and I'll discuss a little later. As I said, they're interested in hearing from you, and you're really the expert that can tell them about specific issues that they should think about, and why they should fund a certain bill, etc., because it matters to the constituents, and that's what they're there for. You can also join science policy discussion groups. So I don't know if Clemson has a science policy group or not. If not, that would be really helpful. A lot of people, when they start out, engage locally with different groups, with local legislators, as well as their university that may have policy that they can learn about, or start their own groups in different ways. So that's also helpful. And then the last level here, science policy fellowship. So this is something that you would apply to and would help you transition into policy by really being sort of in the heart of where things happen, and you can learn kind of the basic skills for that. So if you want to do advocacy, I always say that advocacy takes really as much time as you have. So everybody thinks they have to come to DC and spend a long time to do this. Really, and all of these things that are here are actually advocacy. So if you have a few minutes, you can call your representatives, you can tweet or post on Facebook. Again, if they are on there, and a lot of them are on social media, they can see that. Writing letters and op-eds is very helpful. Again, if you target different newspapers and avenues that they read, like The Hill, for example, there's a lot of other places, but again, this is helpful for writing, but also engaging them in a different way. And attending local meetings. So this is relevant now, I suppose, that you might want to engage with your local legislators. A lot of times they'll have town halls and other events that you can go to. And I've seen people that volunteered in their local office and kind of build their career that way. So I think local engagement, I think, is a big thing now, especially that you can't really travel to DC. If you could, that's, again, as I said, this is really sort of where most of policy happens, and you can engage your representatives through a lab tour, for example. So you could probably do that virtually, visiting their office as well. So again, here would be being on the Hill, but if you're doing state policy, that's a different way of engaging them, and that's also impactful. And more time, if you have more time, you can start your own policy group. So this is highly recommended and has helped, as I said, a lot of students who were interested in policy, that they kind of took a leadership role and developed something in policy, which they used to develop their career on. So these kinds of activities are helpful. So I mentioned the skills to develop. So you might have gathered by now that what you are bringing to the table is expertise in research and engineering and science, and you understand how the scientific process works. You can problem solve, you can analyze data and think critically about it, as well as manage projects. And I can tell you that I pretty much do all of these things in my job. It's just a different way, but I think most of these jobs will involve project management, which is something that you probably know how to do. You'll have to analyze some data. You'll have to summarize a lot of information into short paragraphs. These are things that, again, you already know how to do them. Things that you might want to develop are communicating to non-scientists. So as I mentioned, writing is a way to do that. You can talk to your local representatives, and thinking more broadly about who you're talking to, again, understanding where they're coming from, what their points of view might be on a policy, analyzing the audience that you're talking to. And one of the things that comes up a lot is consensus building. So this is something that, when you're developing a policy, you'll have to get different stakeholders involved. And some of them may be legislators, some might be associations, it might be universities. So this is something that a lot of times advocacy is more powerful if you have different organizations that sign on to the same letter and advocate for that. And we do a lot of that. So this is very important for the field. And then the last one is sort of networking and professional relationships. Again, as I mentioned, a lot of policy happens by sort of, who knows you, who you know, who knows you. And a lot of it happens over coffee and just casual relationships. And, you want to build those so that when you apply for a job or a fellowship, they'll remember you and know that you talk to them, etc. So that actually helped me when I got this job as well. So one of the things I mentioned, that writing is really important, and I've done this in the fellowship that I did, transitioning to this, and here, obviously working on legislation, you would do that. And one of the things to consider is how do you actually learn how to write these documents, because it's very different from scientific writing. So one of the things that has been mentioned is the journal Science, Policy, and Governance. So I wanted to just bring this to your attention because I think it's helpful when you're starting out and could be a good tool for you as professional development. So JSPG is a publication that is internationally recognized, open access, and peer-reviewed. It's also a nonprofit. And the primary goal is to publish research from early career researchers and really think about how we can train them in terms of research and writing credentials in policy. We publish a number of different articles. So you can see here, I mentioned OPEDs, technology assessments might be helpful for you, might be a bit related to engineering, policy memos, analysis, as well as larger write-ups. And we actually really cover every corner of science and technology policy, and I'll show you a few areas later. So that's to say that if you have an idea, an area that you want to publish on, we'd probably publish that. And part of my role here is in doing outreach is to really elevate the issues and the authors by doing interviews and trying to get them on webinars and other meetings, as well as a podcast that we started recently, to get them to talk about their work and disseminate that widely. So here's a list of the different areas that we publish on. Some of these I think are very related and relevant to engineering, like manufacturing, data science, science diplomacy. A lot of these I think can intersect, technology transfer, etc. So you can read this. But this is just to say that it's a very broad number of areas here. And some of the things we've published, so you can look on the website, but this is one that I thought would be interesting to you all, the impacts of emerging technologies on inequality and sustainability. So this is an issue that we published earlier this year in May with the United Nations Major Group for Children and Youth, which is another group that advocates for young scientists within the United Nations. It's pretty cool. And the issue was basically around how do we make technology more equitable across the world. And we had a webinar on this with different stakeholders. It was really fun. So you can watch the recording if you're interested in this. And then we have another issue coming out on climate change, which obviously is an important topic. This is going to be with the United Kingdom Science and Innovations Network. And they will have submissions until January of next year, followed by a competition. And then I think this one, they will have opportunities to actually present at the British Embassy through the competition, I think the top 3. So it's a really select way to, again, get your research published on climate change. And just to show you a few ways that we elevate the early career researcher voices in policy. And again, this is kind of where my role comes in through webinars and meetings. So I mentioned the technology webinar we did. I also do webinars myself to talk about JSPG like we did here around science communication. I organized a meeting around space policy, which is really interesting as well. And we had a few authors on here. So this is a virtual conference that we just held last week. The climate tomorrow actually will have a webinar on this climate policy to discuss what the major issues are and entice people to submit to the issues. So you can still register for this until the end of today. And the podcast, just to show you here. So these are some of the interviews we've done with related to the UNMGCY issue. These are 2 of the authors that spoke. And it's, this is evolving, but it's something that, again, we're using to kind of get their voices out there. And so that's most of the talk. I just want to leave you now with some resources. So I mentioned this Carnegie Mellon Engineering Public Policy. So a lot of the slides on engineering came from this. You're welcome to check that out. I think it's a good model for this kind of degree or that you might be interested in, or just things to research or what they work on. One of the basic articles that I like to recommend is by Chris Pickett. This skills you need for a career in science policy. This was published in ASBMB today, I think, yeah, 2014. There's a number of these articles from scientists who transition into policy, and they wrote them up. I can recommend more if you're interested, but this is a good resource. And then AIMBE, AAAS, a lot of scientific societies have science policy arms or committees that you can join. So that's a good way to get into policy as well. And JSPG, as I mentioned, is also a good resource. And a lot of people who are starting out in policy, JSPG is very helpful for their sort of launch and career on kind of the global stage of policy through the journal. And I just looked at a few articles related to engineering, specifically how can engineers engage in policy. So AIMBE does have this Public Policy Institute training. There's an article in Science about engineers who have done AAAS fellowship. So that's kind of one of the options and ways to transition. And you can see here, there's a mass media fellowship, which is more on the journalism side, etc. So there are a lot of fellowships out there and ways to transition, but these are just some of the ideas and ways to do that. So, okay, that's it. So I'd like to just leave you with my contact information. Feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. My website has all my contacts as well. Feel free to email me if you'd like to chat more about policy. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Bengtson. This was very comprehensive, very helpful. Now we know how our science is seen and considered on the Hill. Also, students who are interested in making decisions in your field might be willing to check into these issues. Do you have any questions for our speaker today? You can ask or put them on the chat. Well, maybe not questions today. Again, it was very comprehensive. Now we know about the field. Very interesting. So we stop here. We thank you so much. And maybe we'll invite you again. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Have
Bye.
a good day. Bye.